I'm just honored and delighted to be here. This event came about almost accidentally. I got a letter from the college and from the church about the archaeological exhibit, and somehow the archaeological exhibit and the Celtic throne and then my speaking sort of all fell together, and it's been just a jam-packed day and a lot of fun. In fact, I'm thinking I'm not leaving.
Well, unfortunately, we'll have to leave later today. Dinesh D'Souza, our featured speaker last night at Armstrong Auditorium, he'll be heading back home, but not until he pays us a visit here at the Trumpet Daily. So a very special edition of the Trumpet Daily today. You can get to the live video stream of this show at trumpetdaily.com or over at the Rumble channel, rumble.com/Trumpet Daily. Mr. D'Souza, glad to have you with us again.
Thank you. Good to be here and looking forward to this.
Well, I say again because he was generous enough with his time to give us a pre-recorded segment where the focus was on two of his books from 2010 and 2012, The Roots of Obama's Rage, and then Obama's America. And of course, he also made a film back at that time on that subject as well. We're probably going to play that for you on Wednesday's show. And to start with on today's show, just to button that up a little bit further, you had, I believe this was from a podcast you gave in August, so a few months ago, where you were comparing, is it David Garrow's book, his biography on Obama, with just some of the things that you have concluded over the years. And maybe we can start with a clip from your podcast. This is clip 3.
Part of his argument is that Obama really is a guy who makes up his own past. He fictionalizes his own history. And so you can't trust the book Dreams from My Father, which was that was Obama's own, The Making of Barack Obama. Now, I read that book very carefully. In fact, I saw in that book a series of ideological formations and commitments completely different from what the media was saying about Obama.
And one of the things you pointed out in the pre-recorded segment that we had was how that Obama's DOJ came after you so aggressively because you exposed him as a fraud.
Yeah, the point about fictionalizing the past, to some degree, all politicians create a sort of storyline about themselves. And the storyline typically has elements of truth, but also some embellishment. In some degree, this is even true of Lincoln with his log. I was raised in a log cabin. That might have been true of Lincoln at one point in his life, but that was, if you had a full understanding of Lincoln's childhood, it wasn't all that. He wasn't like growing up in a log cabin. And but it was a way of Lincoln saying, I'm an ordinary man, you know. And with Obama, he has spun his story in a way that makes him the quintessential American, even though his real story, he's the quintessential anti-American.
Yeah. You definitely want to see the show on Wednesday. We go into a lot of detail. I don't want to rehash everything, but you made some really good points in that podcast from a few months ago. Just to play a couple more before we move on. Try clip 4.
And look, the relevance of this is that Obama he's still got his fingers in the pie. First of all, he lives in Washington, D.C. Kind of odd, right? Here's a guy, he served 2 terms. You think he would go someplace else, live out the rest of his life. No, he wants to run things. He said on video not very long ago that he wouldn't mind a 3rd term. He doesn't necessarily want to serve it himself, but he wouldn't mind whispering into the ear of somebody else who would carry out his orders. Maybe that's what he's doing now.
You refer there to a soundbite that we've probably played a couple dozen times on this show where he talked about the earpiece and being in the basement and the sweats and that sort of thing. And again, we touched on this in the previous segment, but you went on to say he lives in D.C., and there's no stakeouts around his house. Like, you would think if there was a curious reporter that wanted to get, a handle on this interchange between him and Joe Biden, that people would be camped outside of his house. As it is, they don't even cover it.
Exactly, and quite apart from camping out, you would think that there would be a kind of attempt to investigate and kind of monitor what are the connections between Obama, the kind of Obama circle of prominent people who served with Obama, who are now serving with Biden. In other words, isn't there a kind of a web going on? And what is Obama's own role in that web? In some ways, I think Obama took Hillary's defeat very personally because obviously it was partly a referendum on Hillary, but it was also partly a referendum on the Obama years. People were voting against Obama's legacy when they decided to bring in Trump. And so Obama has a great stake in not only his own presidency, but in saving the Obama agenda and in moving it forward. And I believe that to a large degree, that is what's happening under Biden.
Yeah. So tell us, again, that gives you a little foretaste of what you can see on the program Wednesday. Tell us a little bit as we fast forward to today, what projects you've got a movie you're working on for September. And then there's another movie you're going to be working on next year, which we can talk about later. But tell us a little bit about the project for this year.
Well, it's looking at the very, it's a little difficult to make a movie about what's happening now because things are rapidly changing and it is almost impossible to predict what's going to happen. So to take two questions, is it possible that Biden will be pulled off the ticket? It's possible. To me, it would require Biden really plummeting in the polls. If Trump is, 15 points ahead, the Democrats are like, there's no pathway to success with this guy. Maybe there would be an effort to intervene. But it's getting late in the day for that to happen. A second question is it possible that Trump will not only be convicted with all the, guilty headlines all over the country and the world, but be incarcerated? So the Republican nominee for president in a democratic society is in jail. That's a possibility. Is it a likelihood? I don't know. But so this is not a normal type of election year where you can just say, all right, I'll capture what's going on, because there's almost no way to know what's going to happen next.
I asked you the other day about the cheating, the rampant cheating that happened in 2020, and if they'd be able to pull that off again. You said it would be a lot more difficult to just be so audacious as they were, being filmed doing it in your movie 2000 Mules. But you made the point that one reason we know that they're not just banking on the mules again this time, or at least not to the extent that they did in 2020, is because of how aggressively they're going after Donald Trump, using lawfare and the indictments and all of those things, and trying to, as you say, put him in prison. So you feel like the lawfare is sort of is that at the top of their strategy to prevent him from coming back?
Yeah, I think it is, because it is the only kind of guaranteed way.
Yeah.
The other ways might work in a close election, but they would not work in a not close election. You can't get homeless votes and nursing home votes and tip. Like, you couldn't have done that to tip Reagan over Carter, or to change the outcome of Reagan versus Mondale, because Reagan won in a landslide. He won 49 states against Mondale. So he obliterated Mondale. And now our elections are not likely to be that close, to be that wide margin anymore. But I do think that the mule strategy worked partly because of COVID,
right,
and partly because Republicans are so sluggish, the Democrats could say, well, I don't think these guys will even wake up to what's happening, at least until much later when you can't do anything about it. But the Democrats are kind of way too smart to replay the exact same strategy. It's kind of like, don't try to rob the bank exactly the same way, because they're going to be looking for that.
Right. Yeah. Tell us about 2000 Mules. Was that last year or year before?
In 2022.
Okay.
2 years ago.
So that comes out, and as we were discussing the other day, you had the leak coming out of the Supreme Court that happened that exact night that your movie was about to premiere. You told me in the previous segment we recorded that first film you made, Obama's America, that was the most popular one you've produced, right?
Yeah, I think partly it was because it was It was new. I mean, the conservatives were not making documentary films for the most part. There had been a couple of Christian documentary films, but a political documentary in wide release, in other words, in hundreds, actually 2,000 theaters, was just a spectacle. And people were like, wow. Not to mention the fact that the film had a kind of an unexpected angle on Obama, and an angle that required people to scratch their heads and go, well, what is that? You know, Obama is really not so much of a civil rights guy, he's an anti-colonial guy. Well, what's an anti-colonial guy? What does that mean? And so the film becomes an exposition of that. So that film is now the second most successful political documentary after Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11.
Right.
Now, by the time 2,000 Mules came out, and that was like my sixth or seventh documentary, the political landscape was now 2022 was still in the wake of COVID. So the film, although it opened in theaters, opened in a limited theatrical release. Most people who saw that film did not see it in the theater. They saw it by digital download or streaming or DVDs. So the film had but that was, of my 7 films, it would be in terms of just the profitability, the success of the film, the number of people who saw it. The Obama's America, number 1, 2,000 Mules, number 2, although admittedly several other films have done really well as well.
Right. So 2,000 Mules how do you feel like that's changed just people's perception of what happened in 2020?
Well, I asked the people at the Rasmussen survey to do a survey about 2,000 Mules, essentially asking, A, have you seen the film? B, if you haven't seen it, if you heard about it. C, what do you think about the 2020 election? Was it stolen, yes or no? And so a series of questions kind of like that, and the results are very striking because they show that first of all, a lot of people have either seen the film or are familiar with it. They're familiar what it's about and what's in it. Number 2, a decisive majority of Republicans and a substantial minority of independents and Democrats all think the 2020 election was stolen. Now we might argue about, well, was Trump the true winner? But my point is the idea that this was, quote, the most secure election in history, that has been exposed as laughably absurd. No one could actually see this film and go along with that statement. Or if you did, you're a complete idiot. Yeah. So in fact, I've even noticed that they've stopped saying that. That was the big mantra after 2020, but people don't say it anymore because I think they realize how inherently absurd it is.
Oh yeah, Chris Krebs, he was over cybersecurity, and he said it was a perfect election. You had all the Georgia officials, Raffensperger, and everyone saying, perfect. This was no flaws whatsoever. So that's been fully exposed as...
Yeah, a couple of them now try to take refuge and back up, and they'll say things like, well, what we really meant to say is that there were no known cyber attacks on the election. But when you say it's the most secure election, that's not what people mean. What people understand that to mean is that there wasn't significant fraud, or that there wasn't enough cheating to change the outcome of the election. And it's the contention of 2,000 Mules that there was systematic fraud, and while there's room for some disagreement about how much, it is quite possible, indeed probable, that Trump won the 2020 election.
Yeah. You said part of the reason that maybe conservative media weren't quicker, or not even quick, a lot of them just said a few days after the election, let's just move on, we've got to think ahead, we've got to go forward, forget about what's in the past. But that there were some kind of bizarre theories as to how it was stolen, and that you just wanted to stay away from that and just focus on, the location data, the filmings, people on on video that are actually cramming the drop boxes. So what does that mean? You don't like with the machines, and what were some of the other ones you mentioned, the cyber attack and so on. Do you feel like that was, for the most part, those other areas that it was above board and it was mostly the mules, or do you feel like it was kind of a combination of many things?
I'm not an expert on election fraud in the sense that if I'd been studying the topic for years, and True the Vote, which was the organization that was our kind of research or our expert consultants for the movie, they've been at this for 10 years.
Right.
And they will tell you that they think that there's vulnerability in the machines. They will tell you that that there were all kinds of shenanigans that went on. Some of them probable, some of them you can't be sure. So, for example, some of the boarding up of the windows. To this date, we have no plausible explanation for the simultaneous stopping of the count in multiple independent states. They're all supposed to be running their own vote.
Right.
How do they all decide, like within minutes, if not hours of each other, that we're all going to stop the count and pick it up tomorrow morning? That's inherently suspicious. No one has ever given a reasonable explanation for either how or even why that happened. So there are anomalies, but the problem with an anomaly is a conundrum, right? And it leaves you like, I don't know. So I didn't want this film to be a film of maybes and possiblies and this I smell a rat and this is suspicious. I wanted the film to say, all right, I'm not pretending to know about all types of fraud. I'm going to pick the one type that I think can be definitively established, and established by two independent lines of evidence that don't always cross, but when they do cross, they will corroborate each other. So those are two lines of evidence that you yourself can be, at least to some degree, familiar with. If I talk about cell phone geo-tracking, you know, and everybody knows, that your phone can be tracked. And in fact, if you go into a field with tall grass and throw your phone, you could then go to another device and search to find your phone, and it'll take you straight to your phone. It won't take you to within 100 feet of your phone, it'll take you to your phone. And so cell phone geo-tracking works. You don't have a murder case in the country today where they don't track the guy's phone. So, in fact, I heard someone talking on TV the other day, and they were talking about criminal cases. They go, listen, these days juries are not even really that into eyewitness evidence. The evidence that they want is DNA, or they want blood evidence, or they want cell phone geo-tracking, or they want surveillance video. And guess what? Cell phone geo-tracking and surveillance video are the two types of evidence we use in 2000 Mules. So they're very credible, and also, to be honest, very cinematic. For someone making a movie, if I say, here's a guy, I got 100 guys who signed affidavits, to a moviegoer, that means nothing. Who are those guys? What are their affidavits? How do we verify all? So it would take you weeks, if not months, to figure that stuff out. On the other hand, if I say, well, this official footage was taken by the state of Georgia. Right. Now let's watch this guy pull up at 3 a.m. in the morning, jump out of his car, look around suspiciously. He's got a backpack evidently full of ballots. Well, I mean, you can see for yourself. You're at the scene of the crime.
Yeah. We've pointed out on this show how that you were ridiculed a bit for the geo-tracking. Well, it's not reliable. You can't really get a read on where they are exactly. And then here the DOJ and the biggest investigation they've ever unleashed on the January 6th protesters. They're using the geo-tracking technology to try to find out who was where, who went into the Capitol, that sort of thing. You're basically relying on some of the same technology, right?
Right. They look at, if you look at these charging documents, they don't just say, oh, well, you know what, this guy showed up in the general vicinity of the Capitol. They say he was 10 feet inside the door. So in other words, they're trying to show he wasn't just outside the building, he was in the building. Right. And they use his phone to try to pinpoint where he was. Yeah. And this is extremely reliable technology, obviously getting better by the day. And when you're talking about drop boxes, it's not even, you don't even need a precision of 10 feet because the drop boxes are scattered all over the place. So if I can show that you were, let's say, within 50 feet of 8 different drop boxes on a kind of mailman style route that you went, you'd be hard pressed to give me an explanation for why you did that. Why does your phone move at a steady pace, we're obviously driving, stop at a drop box, stay there for 5 minutes, whatever, move on to the next one, stop, and then keep going? I mean, what is the explanation for that? It doesn't matter whether you are, again, 5, 10, 15, or 50 feet away. Why are you following the drop box route?
What kind of reaction did you, or what kind of resistance did you face? We talked in the previous segment about just how Obama's DOJ went after you viciously following your film in 2012. Did you get that same kind of resistance as you were coming into 2,000 Mules?
Well, with 2,000 Mules, there was a supreme effort to discredit the film. You probably heard about Bill Barr dismissing the film, and not these are not people who have serious points to make. In other words, it's not that Bill Barr is offering any kind of critique of the film. Absolutely not. His main tool of derision was just like chuckling, ha 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 ha. But that really won't do. If anyone has seen the film, you realize there's just enough there that you can't write it off like that. That's just not going to work.
Right.
Probably to me, the most disappointing, a lot of good things about the film. It certainly raised awareness about the issue. In the midterm of 2022, there were patriots in Arizona camping by the drop boxes with their cell phones. They're like, okay, if any mules show up, we're ready for them. So people are aware of this method of cheating. But I think what disappointed me was that there are many mainstream Republicans, including some who are conservative. These aren't rhinos, and they were afraid to watch the film. It's not that they watched the film and go, I'm not convinced. They didn't want to see the film because they didn't want to be convinced. They were like, if I watch the film, I'm going to have to do something about it. But if I do something about it, I'm going to be called an election denier. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be called an election denier, a conspiracy theorist. I want to be seen as respectable. And so there was almost a kind of prudent avoidance of the film, even among members of the Republican establishment.
Right. What is that? I mean, just from a personal standpoint, the lack of moral courage. I mean, how does that? You were talking to me the other night about politics and how people go off to Washington with all these, sincere and genuine motives to try to help, and then they get bought out by some lobbyist or they get a huge donation to their PAC. I mean, we talk on this show a lot about just the courage. Like, where is the moral courage to just, as you say, see the evidence and then do something about it? So many of them don't want to even look at the evidence because they don't want to do anything about it.
Human beings are by and large very conformist. And almost all the rhetoric that we hear about independent thought is a rarity, applies only to a few people. College students, for example, like to think of themselves as independent thinkers. They're making up their own minds. But the truth of it is, you can take any cause, climate change, the ozone layer, Gaza, and not only pick any cause, you can rotate the cause. You can say, for the next 6 weeks it's going to be Gaza, and after that we're going to go climate change. And you'll see this, quote, herd of independent thinkers thoughtlessly move from one to the other. And what are they moving in tune with? The drummer. Mm-hmm. The drummer is the approval of the surrounding culture, not American culture, but the campus culture. And similarly, what happens with guys who go to Washington is that Washington is its own village. It's like the ancient village. Now, in the ancient village, the last thing you want would be, gossipy women where every time you walk down the street they go, look at that guy, he's a creep, and think of how awkward that would make you feel, because that's your whole life, that village. The media creates the same environment in Washington, D.C. for congressmen and senators. It's a village. Watch that guy, he's a real creep. So the Republicans live in terror that they don't want to be that guy. And the way you avoid being that guy is that you maintain a conservative portfolio. You certainly campaign on a conservative portfolio, but you don't go too far. And the going too far, the parameters of that is set by the media. So the two taboo topics, election fraud is one of them, and that's a taboo. January 6th is the other one. And so sure enough, there are a lot of conservatives, good guys for the most part, but they won't touch those two issues.
And I think this is what really sets apart, and you touched on this in your public address the other night, it's what sets Donald Trump apart. He brings up topics, he goes there when others are too afraid, they don't want to go there. Maybe you could talk, we kind of discussed last night some of the differences between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, but How is Donald Trump a man for the times that we're in at this moment?
With Reagan, the dividing line was between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the threat was coming from abroad. And that gave Reagan a certain unifying posture in the United States because the enemy was over there. With Trump, the situation has changed completely. Our greatest threats are from within. Putin is much less of a danger just to not just my rights, my basic security. If I am concerned that a group of militarized thugs will show up at my door and kill me, and I'm not even speaking metaphorically here, and I had to check a box as to who that's most likely to be, I would check the box that said the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Our own FBI is most likely to do, I'm not saying that they're going to do that, but I'm saying if I had to compare, is it going to be, Putin? Is it going to be an Iranian terrorist? Or is it going to be the FBI? I check confidently the FBI. So think of what that tells you. That's a different America. Oh, yeah. Trump knows that. Many other Republicans know that, but they have the mentality, I mentioned this in my lecture, of the wildebeest, where they want to be, they could define success as being eaten last by the lion.
Yeah, yeah. So how do you, what's your take on the Trump phenomenon? He's, they've tried to destroy him every step of the way. And, if you listen to Scarborough and company, they all said he was finished, years ago. Mr. Trump, what does it tell you about the man's courage and his resilience and his willingness to make sacrifices for the United States?
Well, he is one of those, once in a generation, maybe even once in a lifetime type of figures that appears on the scene. There's no one kind of like him. He has no ancestors. You can't say he's in the tradition of so-and-so. He isn't. I don't think that when he leaves the scene there will be anyone like him for a long time, if ever. So he is in that sense unique. He also has, and the left is right about this, a certain kind of talismanic or transcendent type of power. So when they say he's an insurrectionist, he's actually not. He didn't call for an insurrection. There was no insurrection on January 6th. But he is one of the few people who could have. He could have called for an insurrection. There would have been one. He could still do it. If Trump were to say now that America is in a state of civil war and people need to pile up on weapons and they need to recognize the situation, people would do those things. No one else has that kind of power. Biden can't call an insurrection, Lindsey Graham can't call an insurrection. It would be a joke. So Trump, in that sense, is sui generis. He's in his own category. And therefore, I'm almost speechless when I hear people say things like, well, I don't really know if I could bring myself to vote for him because I don't like his temperament, and I don't like his tweets. Such a statement reveals you to be a petty person with no sense of the overall stakes. It's kind of like someone who would say, to give you an analogy, if someone were to say, well, I really am not that comfortable with General Grant. I hear that he ran his father's store into the ground and he was kind of a drunk and a womanizer. The point is, you're in a civil war.
Right.
This is the guy who's taking the fight to Lee. This is the guy who will assure Lincoln of his re-election in 1864. And you're talking this kind of nonsense at this late stage. This is so I literally get not triggered, but I'm like, I cannot even grasp your pettiness and lack of perspective in uttering such idiocies in such a troubling time for the country. If you said these things in 1986, I would laugh. But for you to say them now is a very bad reflection on you.
Yeah, it's a different time.
Yeah.
So your film that you're producing this year, you said the other night you want Donald Trump to be featured prominently in the story. What are you hoping to get out of him as far as the interview for the film is concerned?
Well, I want to do a kind of an in-depth conversation with Trump, but I want to bring out a side of Trump that I think has not been shown to the American people. when I look at political figures that I've crossed paths with, I find that some of them are the same in public as they are in private. A good example is Reagan. If we had Reagan sitting right here, he would sound exactly like the public Reagan you've seen on TV. Well, Dinesh, we give it the good. I think that we had a revolution and it's been a success and America's best days are ahead. Reagan in public and Reagan in private are identical. With Trump, that's not the case. Trump in public is, and the reason I actually laugh when I say this is it's actually even true of me in my own way. Because people will say, and my wife sometimes goes, Dinesh, she goes, you are just so like ruthless and savage on Twitter, on X. She goes, it's not like you at all. She goes, in person, you're not confrontational. You don't like degrade people and attack them. She goes, and I go, honey, that's my Twitter persona. I go, that is, I'm not saying that that's not me. It's one part of me, and it's partly dictated not just by me. It's dictated by the medium. It's kind of like, Dinesh at the tennis court is going to be different than Dinesh lost in the jungle. So Twitter is more like the Wild West. Everyone's like that,
right.
And so you have to. That's the way you fight in that domain. Now, on the other hand, if I'm debating somebody on a stage, I'll follow the etiquette and Mr. Chairman, may I interject? And
right.
I'll play by the Oxford rules because that's the format.
Right.
So with Trump, there is a whole side of Trump that I think would be very interesting and disarming to Americans to see. I've got to bring it out of him.
Right.
Because it's actually not his style of doing interviews. His style of doing interviews is you ask him a question, he speaks for 20 minutes straight. And he's got certain things that are bothering him and he wants to get them off his chest. As opposed to a more controlled format where I'm trying to get him to answer very precise questions and let me control the agenda. That's not easy, so that's going to be the challenge.
No, you've got your work cut out for you.
For sure, for sure.
We'll look forward to that film as it comes out later this year. So there's so much to get to. I want to talk just a little bit about your visit on campus. You've been with us for a couple of days here. Your first experience with us was to get the guided tour through the Kingdom of David and Solomon exhibit. You mentioned the other day that you are going to be working on a film next year about Israel. So yeah, tell us what led to our conversation. Initially was a podcast you did on archaeology, and you interviewed a man that we're mutual friends with, and so yeah, how do you? First, what's your reaction to just the exhibit we have at Armstrong Auditorium?
Remarkable. I mean, an amazing and highly informative. You don't know what to expect. I got a letter from you guys about the fact that you had done some work with a prominent Israeli archaeologist whose work I'm interested in because she is she's dead now, but her work was, you could call it biblical archaeology.
Right.
And biblical archaeology essentially takes the Bible on the one side and the findings of secular archaeology on the other and holds them up one against the other to compare. There are archaeologists who do work and they don't do that. They're not interested in the Bible per se. They're just like, I found a stone, it's from this period, this is what it means. But a biblical archaeologist will say in the book of Kings, it says that there was a tall mountain, and it says that beyond the mountain were some orchards, and then beyond this were the people, let's just say the Canaanites. And so it's interesting to look at archaeology. Well, what does archaeology say about where's that mountain? And what's beyond it? And were in fact the people who live beyond that the Canaanites? In other words, is the Bible giving you an accurate description of the time and the place and the who or is the Bible a sort of a loose sort of collection of moral fables, not without value, but nevertheless not talking about real people and real places and real times. Yeah. So this to me is the great importance of biblical archaeology. In any event, I knew that you had an exhibit on the Solomon and David period, but I didn't know what was in it. And boy, did I learn a lot. And I've taken a booklet, which I'm going to study very carefully because there's just so much there.
Yeah. Yeah, you alluded to the late Dr. Alat Mazar. She famously started her excavations into the city of David by looking at a scripture in, I think it's 2 Samuel 5, where it says when the Jebusites were on the attack, headed to Jerusalem, that King David went down to the fortress. So there was the Jebusite fortress, and David was, engaged in building a new palace for him. And just that one word, down, she's like, okay, the palace had to have been situated higher up the hill of the city of David. So, and she had this article in Biblical Archaeology Review from 1997 where she had a picture of the city of David and then this red arrow that said, this is where the palace is, just let me dig, just give me the funding, and the support, and we'll start digging. And she did, and sure enough, she discovers this Davidic wall and a couple of bullae along the way.
I was at the Palace of David in December of 2022, and we're getting kind of a tour. And as you go at the top of the ruins, top of the palace, you look across. There's a hillside below, and even now you have all these homes scattered across the hillside. And the homes, typically built in that style, have terraces. And I was thinking about the passage about David and Bathsheba, which on the face of it, when you read it, knowing nothing about any of this, is odd. Here's David, he's in the palace. He looks out and he sees a woman, apparently semi-nude or nude, bathing. Right? But this is odd because by and large, if a woman is taking a bath, she's not going to be doing it in a place where she's going to be visible. And yet, what's interesting is that you now begin to understand that in a low-lying area, if you're up on a terrace, for example, you're not visible. But you're not visible except to one person. And that is the guy who is in the palace that is built at the highest point, who can actually see right down and see you straight. So suddenly, the whole David Bathsheba incident makes complete sense. You can see how it happened, and it kind of brings you to the scene of the event. I think that, as a guy who's a movie maker, I mean, there is that's what you try to do in film. You try to bring someone to the scene of the event. And you can't make a good movie that doesn't do that. So I find archaeology coming to life in a very powerful way. And I also think that in this secular age, this type of apologetics, if you will, for the authenticity of the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures is perhaps the best way to go.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned the story with David and Bathsheba, because I had a conversation with Dr. Mazar as we were talking about where the palace was situated, and I brought that up. I said, well, that also makes perfect sense. If he's high up in the palace, that he could have seen, Bathsheba, and then she was not religious at all. But she sees the Old Testament as her history book. I mean, this is the history of her people. So anyway, when I brought up Bathsheba, she's like, "Oh, you Christians, you always want to get into the teachings and what happened and this or that, And she just wanted to know the archaeology. And I said, well, still, the picture, as you say, if you're producing a film, all of a sudden you see it. You see, this is, if we could put this to video, it tells the story. And of course, we believe all the stories are true, as well as the geography and, where things were situated, as far as archaeology is concerned.
We had a guide who was a Messianic Jew, a guy who was a believer in Jesus, but nevertheless kept all the Jewish customs. And in fact, his father was a rabbi. And he was talking to us about, in Israel, about the folded clothes that the women found at the tomb. There's a reference to some folded cloths and robes. And to anyone reading the incident now, it would be like, oh, that's interesting. You got some folded clothes, when the tomb is empty and there are these folded clothes. And but what this guy says, he goes, listen, he goes, in Jewish culture, these things have a lot of significance. So he goes, take my dad. He goes, my dad's a rabbi. He often has a get-together and he brings a whole bunch of people together, scholars or people who are visiting. And he says, it's quite possible in the middle of the meal or the middle of the meeting my dad will take these cloths that are this tablecloth or the serviettes and so on, and he will fold them, put them in a stack, and then just walk out. Or at other times, he might take the cloths and not fold them and just toss them on the table and walk out. And he goes, those two things have a completely different meaning. Because if my dad folds the cloths and puts them in one corner and leaves, that implies that he's returning. And in fact, no one gets up to leave because that's the meaning of the folded cloths. If on the other hand, my dad tosses it on the table, it means we're done, we can all leave. So now take just that simple, tiny nugget of Jewish customary practice and apply it to the folded clothes in the tomb. And you get a completely different look at it, a different way of thinking about it. Now, again, if you're not, you want to just dismiss it out of hand, you can, but I don't think you can deny that there's something interesting going on, and that, I mean, even remove it from a religious context. If I was talking about Hamlet and someone told me about folded clothes and gave me this, I would be like, that's interesting. I'm going to write an essay on that because that changes the traditional or naive meaning of the text and it throws a new light on it. Same here.
So coming back to your film, you said you want archaeology to tell part of that story. What is the premise of the documentary you're going to be doing next year on Israel?
The film is, if I did a film on just biblical archaeology, it might seem to be for specialists or aimed at a niche audience. So the film is on Israel, terrorism, anti-Semitism. It will tie in what's going on over there with things going on the campus and in the street over here. So it is, in that sense, a film very much tied to current events. However, in discussing this, a film always needs to step back and ask, what is this fight all about? And the core question at the heart of it, I think, is whose land is it? Who does this piece of land belong to? And to answer that question, it is not irrelevant to say, well, who used to live here and when? And so biblical archaeology is a way of bringing in that discussion. So I see this film as a political film, but with a very interesting dimension of Jewish and Christian apologetics, because it is, to quote one of your brochures, it's letting the stones speak.
Right.
In a very and let people draw both political conclusions and perhaps even spiritual ones.
Yeah, sounds great. Yesterday, following your guided tour, you then were nice enough to sit in on Celtic Throne, another Celtic Throne performance. Do you guys have the clip of him backstage? If so, you can play that.
I did not expect it. It was great. How long have you guys been working on this? A while. Well, it shows. Look at you little guys. You're amazing. You're all great performers. And smiling too. Well, congratulations on an amazing performance. I'm delighted to be part of it. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for coming.
So you told me that you and your wife enjoy going out for opera or Broadway shows. What was your reaction to Celtic Throne?
I mean, I was really thrilled. I enjoyed it, watching it. It was varied. It was the music was fantastic. The dancing was memorable and great. It was fun to see. I wouldn't say all ages, but really from, what is it, age 2 to age 3, all the way up to maybe 20-somethings performing, and at a very high quality. I mean, you felt like this was this could have been a Broadway performance. It was just beautifully done. I was kind of wishing my wife was there because she loves music, she loves dance. She used to be a dancer at one time. She's made movies, she's sung in our movies, right. Debbie has. And I think it was just a beautiful evocation of a time and a place, and just great Irish music and dance.
Well, I know the kids got a thrill with you coming backstage, and they're all homegrown. They all train right here on campus, and they're all about to hit the road to dance in.
Well, you're invited to a campus. Typically, you're expecting to see a kind of a school level or maybe college level performance, and not something where you got some of the top dancers in the world performing. And I think that's what took me aback is I saw at least 3 or 4 of the male dancers, and I'm like, you guys could. I don't know if you are professionals, but you easily could be. You're that good.
Mm-hmm. Well, we appreciate you viewing that, and you can bring your wife back next time, and hopefully she can take a look at it as well.
That would be great.
I just want to finish on a few personal notes, I guess. I kind of told you about this the other night, but yeah, your impact, just your writings on me personally back in the 1990s, I have to say, forgive me, I was probably more avidly reading your writings then. I was coming out of college, I didn't quite finish college, and I knew you were into not just current events and things of that nature, but you were also, a product of higher education here in the United States. And so, yeah, some of the early writings, I mentioned that book, The End of Racism. I think that was 1995. Fantastic book. I was scouring the house and my office for it. I don't know what happened to it, but I'm going to go get another copy. I had it all marked up and everything. But then right around that same time, you had the biography on Ronald Reagan, on leadership. And then, too, I was always fascinated by your book, Illiberal Education, where you talked about how in modern education today, students will come into the campus and they're sold a bill of goods on it's a tolerant atmosphere, you're all coming together. But what you pointed out is that really what happens once they get to the campus is it's a very polarized environment, and they go and they sort of associate with their group. And maybe it's been a long time since you wrote that, but what have you seen in just higher education today that, given how involved you were with Dartmouth way back when, and then just the differences today with all these campus protests and everything else, where the colleges, it seems, they're churning out people that are just feeding on propaganda?
Yeah, that's the point, is that things have gotten, I think, sadly, a lot worse. In a way, you could almost say that there's no more polarization, in the sense that the polarization ends when conformity begins. So think, for example, about, you have a Marxist revolution in a country. It's polarized because you have people for it, against it. But once the Marxists have crushed everybody else, then they establish uniformity. Then there's no real polarization. Or if there's polarization, people are internal dissidents, but they can't speak up. That's what's happened on the campus. The conservatives are now tiny pockets. Conservative professors, by and large, never say what they are. They keep quiet. They're in hiding, really. And it's like in Hollywood, where you've got a group of conservatives, and they have a group that they belong to, but they meet in secret because it would ruin their careers if their identities were known. So this is a sign not of a free society, but these are elements of unfree societies. And the campus is, but when I think back on Illiberal Education, came out in 91, and then in paperback in 92, it identified a phenomenon that is still recognizable to us. The fact that campuses, if you look at their catalogs, you see liberal education. If you are on the campus, you see illiberal education, the exact opposite. A repudiation of all the principles of liberal education. So our campuses are really no longer campuses in the original meaning of the term. Education in its normal sense is not what happens there. I'm not saying that there's no education that occurs, but it's subordinate to politics, subordinate to ideology. I'm very lucky in my career that both my first book, Illiberal Education, and my first film, Obama's America, were huge successes, because it paved the way for me to have a career as an author for many years, and then a career as a filmmaker. And so, in other words, it's from a career point of view, it is very fortunate to, it's kind of like going out on the baseball field and hitting a home run the first shot.
Yeah.
It sets you up for a lot of subsequent games.
Yeah. How long as a student and then an administrator were you at Dartmouth?
I was never an administrator there. I was just a student from 1979 to 83. I graduated in 83. I then went to Princeton, where I worked for a magazine before coming to Washington to work for another magazine called Policy Review. Then I joined the Reagan White House for 2 years, and then I spent about 20 years in two prominent think tanks or research foundations, the American Enterprise Institute and the Hoover Institution. So although I've been in quasi-academic institutions most of my life. It's not as a professor. It's more like a research scholar and an author.
Yeah. Did you see a strong Marxist influence when you were there as a student?
A strong leftist influence that is shaped by Marxism, although not exclusively by Marxism. Leftist influence was also shaped by a lot of things that tied into Marxism but weren't explicitly Marxist. So, for example, the idea that the world is running out of resources. It's not a Marxist idea, but it can tie into, because it leads to Marxist-type solutions.
Right.
Or even climate change. There's nothing inherently Marxist about climate change, but it's used by Marxists to advance their agenda. And by and large, I think I've encountered the paradox of the highly affluent student on these campuses where you want for nothing. And I was actually struck coming from India. Wow, I mean, in India, by and large, if you want to go play tennis, there's a long line for the tennis court. You have to sign up, wait for your turn, because there's one court. Then I go to Dartmouth, and there's like tennis courts as far as the eye can see, and most of them are like empty. Just take a ball and go start playing. And I was like, wow. And then I go into these big reading rooms, and they're, first of all, Dartmouth's in New Hampshire, so it's very cold in the winter, but these are like heated all night, and they've got like coffee and donuts. And I was like, this is a level of abundance that it just took me aback. Even by the standard of American abundance, it was at another level. And so these kids have everything. And therefore, it's so odd and so pathological and perverted for me to see these kids. And they want to be like the Gazans, but they're not like the Gazans, So what do? They're like, I'll take over a building and then I'll claim I have no food. The dining hall is actually open, and so are all these restaurants, and I can actually be eating in any of them right now. But no, I go barricade myself in a building. Please give me water. Please give me food. I'm like the Gazans. This is like role playing. It's fantasy, and it's fantasy of a twisted sort.
Yeah. So when you went to Dartmouth, you went right into the school newspaper, is that right? Or?
I did, and then we actually started a rebel conservative newspaper, a bunch of us, called the Dartmouth Review.
So how did you, for such a young man at the time, and you came over as an exchange student to Arizona, even in your high school days, but what is it that shaped your worldview early on to where you were pretty conservative, straight away?
Yeah, I think what it was is that there were a group of upperclassmen, older guys, who I kind of fell into their group, and I noticed that they were extremely well read outside of the classroom. So they would be like, well, as Adam Smith once put it, and well, as Friedrich Hayek notes in his latest, in his book on the industrial society, and so Solzhenitsyn, Margaret Thatcher, and Adam Smith, Ricardo, Keynes, Hayek, this was their currency. They spoke about this kind, and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm 18, but you guys are only 20. Like, what are you talking about? Like, who told you to read all these books? What do these books even say? So I began to immerse myself in learning about these things, and then what comes into view for me is a conservative philosophy, and I go, wow, that is actually what I've always believed. In other words, I didn't become a conservative. I came to the awareness that this was an elaborated explanation for things that I already held to be true. It's kind of like you believe that 2 + 2 is 4 because you're taught that as a kid. But later you actually see a proof. Right. And you're like, oh wow, 2 and 2 actually indeed is 4. But not just because I saw 2 apples here and 2 apples over there and then I counted, I got 4. But that there's actually a logical underpinning for something that I thought before, but now I see the full kind of intellectual fortification for that.
Right. Well, that's a perfect lead into the last question, I promise. Where, as you know, there's a small liberal arts college here on this church campus. And being in academia, to the extent that you were, and just all the work you've done since that time with books and films, what would you tell a group of 19-year-olds as far as just preparing them for life and being like educated, having a broad education like those older students that you met way back in the day? Given the course that higher education is on, and it's a pretty bad one, what would you tell a group of young students as to, this is what I would suggest to prepare you best for life?
Yeah, I think that for me, at Dartmouth, I caught a certain type of a bug, and that bug, I believe, is the germ of true education. That bug is the bug that, as an adult or as a young adult, takes you back to when you were 3 years old. And the world was a wondrous and a strange place in which nothing was, quote, normal. Everything sort of needed to have an explanation. Like, why does this guy have only one eye? And why why are there tides? Why does the ocean come out and then go back? And so there is this naive curiosity that we have as kids. But very often those questions are not really addressed, partly because the adults that we ask them to don't know the answer. So we learn to drop those questions. And then we go off to college and we never go back to basic curiosity questions. Instead, what we do is we now go into what I would call systematic learning. So systematic learning would be, I'm going to now tell you what Plato believed. But the truth of it is, who cares what Plato believed? In other words, it's not important for me to know this is what Plato believed, and this is what Aristotle believed, and this is what Kant believed, and this is... No, what's really interesting to me is to take a question that is a real question in the world. And the only reason we go to Plato is he had an interesting way to look at that question, to show me something where I go, whoa, I didn't think of that. In philosophy, to take a very simple example, we always assume in normal life, and philosophers have assumed for centuries, that when you take in the world as it is and the world as it is pictured in your mind are the same. So in other words, your mind is like a camera. It looks at the world, I look at the ocean, and now obviously the physical ocean doesn't come into my head, so my mind is making a picture of the ocean. And I assume, and I naively assume, and there's no other way to operate, I go, the picture that I see of the ocean in my head is the same as the ocean. But if you actually think about it, it's actually hard to know that, right? Because we know, first of all, in many cases we see things, let's say you see a mirage, or you see an oasis, and the oasis turns out not to be there as you approach it closer, or you look at a stick in the water and it looks bent, even though it's a straight stick, you just put it in there yourself. So even though you know that your senses can deceive you, we always operate with the assumption that the world as it is and the world as we experience it are the same. So along comes a philosopher, in this case it happens to be Immanuel Kant, and he goes, no, the world as we experience it is a product of the world, but it's also a product of our minds acting upon the world. So what we're getting is a hybrid experience that combines the thing out there and combines our mind. But that combination is different than the thing in itself. And we've always kind of known that, but until Kant points it out, we don't really see it. We've always known, for example, let's just say I pick up something and I smell it, and I go, oh, that smells horrible, right? We can always ask the question, is the smell in the thing, or is it in me? Where's the smell coming from? In other words, is the smell the product of my faculties of smelling something, or is there something in the chemicals, in the physical object that creates smell? What is it? This kind of thing. So I'm saying education is all about taking our experience in the world, and I would say the most important thing is never to lose that sense of naive, childlike curiosity. The greatest of all discoverers and philosophers have had that thing. That's the common thing they've all had. And they're able to ask a crazy question, and exploring that question brings them to their great discovery, Yeah. So with Einstein, for example, it's sort of like, here's a light beam, right? And it's going at this tremendous speed. What if I could actually get in a spaceship and ride alongside the light beam, go right alongside it, and then I measure the speed of light? What number would I get? That's Einstein is asking this exact question. But the perversity of Einstein, or the genius of Einstein, is to ask the question. Once you ask the question, interesting answers begin to suggest themselves. Because then you begin to think like this. You begin to think, well, okay, well, if I was in a train and it's going 20 miles an hour, and here's another train going 40 miles an hour, if I had a speed stick, I would measure 20, because I'm going at 20 and the train is going at 40. But Einstein realized that if light is traveling and I'm going alongside light and I measure the speed of light, that speed of light will never change, even if I'm going alongside it. And once you see that, you're like, something very strange is happening here. And I now need to like rethink the whole way I think about space and time. So I try to bring this kind of wide curiosity to politics.
Yeah.
And that's different than a lot of other people. And so people who like my work generally have this aspect of it appeals to them.
So maintain that childlike curiosity.
Right. Yes.
Dinesh D'Souza, thanks for joining us on today's show.
My pleasure.
In my father's book, he wrote this book in 2012, America Under Attack, and he opens the book talking about the swooning media and the captivating influence that Barack Obama had on the media. And just looking at your book, The Roots of Obama's Rage, this is why your book really got our attention, because you were one of the rare exceptions that said, hey, we need to properly vet this guy. I think you said he's maybe the least known figure ever to reach the presidency. And then there were people in the media at that time that were almost bragging about it. Like, yeah, and Hastings himself said, yeah, I swooned too. And it was almost like they were proud of it. So just coming to the premise of your 2010 book, I mean, that was pretty early on. Barack Obama comes in 2009. And you were, as I say, a rare exception that actually said, no, we need to look at his background. We need to consider his worldview. So I guess before you get to some of the content of your book, what was it that sort of got you going in that study?
Well, I think with Obama, there were a couple of key factors that explained why the media in general was so devotional in their coverage. The first was that, of course, Obama was black. That is the huge factor. First black president just created talk about a presidential immunity, right? An immunity from scrutiny. And nobody wanted him to fail. So as a result, it was, listen, whatever we got, we're going to prop this guy up. But the second factor was that Obama himself was, and I would contrast him, for example, with the Biden administration. Obama was very sneaky. He was covert about his agenda, and he was centrist in his rhetoric. If you listen to Obama when he spoke at the Democratic National Convention, I think this was 2004.
Right.
There's no red America, there's no blue America, there's only the United States of America. Deafening applause, And Obama knew how to prosecute a very left-wing agenda, but sounding like he had always at least taken into account the other guy's views. So even a lot of Republicans were, if not charmed by Obama, a little immobilized by Obama. So yes, this guy came in, like a messianic figure, and I was myself a little bit thrown off track at the very, very beginning because I didn't know much about Obama, and the media coverage was heavily focused on the fact that he was a civil rights hero. He was the reincarnation of Martin Luther King, if you will. What King did for the law, Obama was going to do for the presidency and for public policy. And it just took a little bit of just cursory, scrutiny of Obama to realize, wait a minute, that's not who Obama is. That's not his real background. That's not what motivates him. And again, this isn't like my viewpoint. This is Obama's viewpoint. Obama himself, quite in a very confessional way in his book, Dreams from My Father, lays out what's important to him, lays out his story of development and how he became Obama.
Yeah, you made that point right at the start of your book. I'll just give you a quote. You said, Obama learned to see America as a force for global domination and destruction. And then further on, you said Obama's anti-colonialism is deeply felt, and it suffuses his writings and speeches. So as you say, you're just getting it from him, basically. In fact, it is the moral and intellectual foundation of his ideology. In a sense, I'm saying nothing more than what Obama himself says, that his father's dream has become his dream. It's a dream that as president, he's imposing with a vengeance on America and the world. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the resistance that you met. It was first, I think you had an excerpted portion in a magazine, if I recall. I read that, then I'm like, I got to get the book. And then I have some clips. We can play them if we have time later. But it wasn't received very well. They thought you were really going after Obama without cause.
Well, Steve Forbes was the editor of Forbes magazine, and so I was talking to him at a Forbes conference about the fact that people are misreading Obama.
Right.
And I mentioned that I had read Dreams from My Father. I pointed out to Steve Forbes, first of all, I said, pay attention to the title. It's not Dreams of My Father. I'm not writing a bio of my father and what his dreams were. Dreams from my father. Here are the dreams that I, Obama, got from my dad. So it's kind of important. That's his autobiography. What are those dreams? What was Obama's father's worldview?
Right.
And the answer to that happens to be very well known. His father was a kind of a public figure, certainly at least in Kenya, and his dominant way of thinking, his worldview, was anti-colonialism. I recognize this partly because India was a colonial property, if you will, of the British for a long time. In fact, it was the crown of the British Empire. And in India, as in many other parts of the world, in the second half of the 20th century, this anti-colonial ideology emerged. It was because of colonialism. It was anti-Western. It was anti-British specifically, but it also became anti-American because after World War II, it's almost like the baton of Western civilization passed from England to America. And so the premise of my study of Obama was, if we assume that Obama took this anti-colonial ideology from his dad, as he says he did, how does that explain what he's doing? And it turned out it explains it very well. But when Steve Forbes let me write the cover story for Forbes, and I wanted to put the article in a mainstream magazine, not in National Review or a conservative magazine, caused a big stir because the White House went berserk. They called in their Forbes people in Washington, screamed at them why are you guys doing this? And what a disgraceful attack on, our, demigod here, Obama. And I found all of this very amusing and entertaining.
Did you have a team of researchers? You've written so many books. I'm sure you have a few that have helped research and that sort of thing over the years. I mean,
typically I have one. In other words, I will bring on usually a young college graduate, someone in their 20s.
Right.
For some years, I had a pipeline to Dartmouth because I went there and there was a conservative newspaper there that I was part of. So I would hire kids out of Dartmouth. Sometimes I just found them in San Diego, where I lived at the time. And this would be sort of my fact checker, my gopher, but the books I found I would pretty much do most of it myself, because number one, I take a lot of pride in the crafting of the books, the actual writing of it, and the second, you just have to be particularly when you're taking on a sacred cow like Obama, you need to be very thorough and very exact with regard to footnotes.
Right.
And so, because everything is going to be checked. Our culture now has become more casual. I mean, look at all these cases of plagiarism being discovered. And obviously they weren't discovered for years because no one's checking. But when I published the Obama book, really a decade ago, you had to assume that every footnote, someone is going to go look at your quotation, go look at the original source, not just for the quote, but for the context.
Right. So you mentioned going to Forbes, you wanted to go to a mainstream outlet to release the first version of this. Some of the clips that our team pulled together are you going on to CNN or same thing, and they didn't like it at all. They kind of attacked you. They said it was not based in fact, and that sort of. Elliot Spitzer, I think, was one when he was on with CNN. This is years ago. But was that also something that you wanted as your strategy? Like, I need to get this more to the left and let them wrestle with it.
Yeah, I think that our culture was a little less polarized then, and it's important to realize that Obama himself was an agent of polarization. So you can almost talk about American culture before Obama and after Obama. And there's the wedge. There was a bit of a wedge, but it went much deeper.
Right.
So, for example, it was not abnormal for me to go on shows like CNN. And because, remember, CNN had a show called Crossfire. They have someone on the left, they have someone on the right, which would be inconceivable for CNN to do now. And there was a sense that there is a legitimate conservative point of view, just as there's a point of view from the left. And we need to sort of hear both, and we need to hold the one up against the other. So people would argue about Obama. And the problem that they had, of course, was that Obama grew up in Hawaii in a very unconventional arrangement. His parents were both left-wing radicals of one type or another. They were very different from each other, but their left-wing radicalism held them together. That's how they came together in the first place. They had this in common. And Obama's mom later left the United States and went to Indonesia,
right.
Where she kind of took up with a guy over there because she also had this anti-colonial philosophy. Mm-hmm. And so Obama was getting it from both sides, and his book is full of quotations about Western pillage and Western imperialism and stealing the oil wealth of the non-West and so on. So I was on very firm ground. And then Obama was doing things like, I'm going to remove the Winston Churchill bust from the White House.
Right.
Now, that's not normally something that you'd want to do, because even Democrats and liberals in the United States like Churchill. He's known by and large as the hero of World War II.
Right.
But for anti-colonialists, he's known as the guy who presided over the British Empire, the guy who ridiculed Gandhi, the guy who supported Western imperialism in Kenya, which is, of course, where Obama's father's from. And so there's a hatred toward Churchill based on that. But that is not even well known in America. But Obama knew it because he got it from his dad.
Right. Yeah, you talk in your book, you talk about the uprising in Kenya, I believe, is in the 50s. And was that when Churchill came back for that later? I know he was out for a while, and then he came back as prime minister. But did he have a direct hand in crushing that uprising?
Yeah, there was Churchill was definitely both Churchill basically thought it was a tragedy that World War II was bringing the British Empire to an end. And he saw his job as one of holding on to it as much as he could.
Yeah.
He was a genuine believer in the old school that the empire was, on the balance, a good thing.
Right.
Now, ironically, over the years, today, you will find many Indians and many people who come from that background who will defend the empire in exactly the Churchillian mode. Mm-hmm. But that was not common in the 50s mm-hmm. and 60s. And in fact, it wasn't common even when I was a student in the late 70s and 80s. You could not say a good word about colonialism. I've been a little bit of a maverick. I wrote an article in a very prestigious academic magazine called The Chronicle of Higher Education, called 2 Cheers for Colonialism. I didn't go as far as to do 3 cheers, but I thought I'd do 2 cheers, and that caused a big stir because all these academics started screaming at me, and they were, of course, particularly offended that an Asian Indian would be making this point,
right.
which was a very Churchillian point. So yes, the massacres that are now pretty well documented, and it's quite clear that there was a lot of excess, and there were a lot of people who were just imprisoned essentially without being tried, and there were quite a few people who were hanged in retaliation. So all of this was a smoldering memory, certainly for Barack Obama Sr. And Obama himself always saw himself as a kind of a citizen of the world.
Yeah.
When you listen to him talk, for example, in Cairo, some of the other speeches, you don't even get the idea that he sees himself as, I'm representing the United States, I'm defending U.S. interests, which is not the way he thought about things.
Right. Did you, I mean, my father really has drawn attention to the fundamental transformation, that comment he made in 2008. Was that something, that statement, that was just a few days before the election, did that sort of concern you to say something like what needs to be fundamentally transformed?
I think it did, but only in retrospect. In other words, I don't think when it was first said that the full significance of it sank into me. In other words, it's not uncommon as boilerplate rhetoric. You come, we're about to change America. You know, this is something you could hear from Republicans or Democrats. So I think initially I took it in that spirit. It's essentially what Obama is saying was, my election means that the Reagan era is over. Because I think it's fair to say the Reagan era, which began in 1980, kind of came to an end in 2008. So Obama was right about that. What we didn't see immediately, although it became quickly apparent, is that Obama wanted to take a lot of things that we identify with American exceptionalism. If you say America is good because, and then you list 10 things, he wanted to change all those 10. Kind of a startling idea. I don't think most Americans had even a clue about this, and Obama himself was pretty stealthy about going about it. You'll very rarely hear him make direct and explicit attacks on these things. He'll never say things like, you know, I'm against ladders of opportunity. I don't want people to start at the bottom of the ladder and come up, or I don't want America to be a force for good in the world. In fact, this is part of his chameleonic rhetoric, where he sounds fairly traditional, but his agenda is anything but.
Right. So the Obama's Rage book, that's 2010. Then you come out with Obama's America in 2012. That's an election year. He's running for, I haven't gone through that book as much, but how does that message add to what you had revealed in the previous book?
Essentially, it's an update. In other words, in 2010 really reflected just 1 year of Obama. He came in early 2009, as you mentioned, January. So the book came out, in the middle of 2010. So it captured the early moves of Obama, right? But by 2012, he had been in for almost 4 years.
Right.
He was running for re-election, and a lot had happened. The Arab Spring. And so the question really was, was my framework as laid out in the Roots of Obama's Rage, could it be validated by looking at the entire first term of Obama's presidency? And second, would it be predictive of what Obama would do in the second term? So the second book, Obama's America, is the companion to the film 2016 Obama's America, and they came out at the same time. So it captures all of the first term, and it predicts the second term, and in retrospect, it's kind of fun to go back and watch the movie or go back and read, because I think if someone read Obama's America today, they'd be like, yeah, that's obviously what Obama is. Although at the time, people were like, even National Review, the kind of, at that time stalwart publication of the right, was sputtering with confusion with Dinesh. They were a little upset with me. But not only because they felt my criticism of Obama was too harsh, but they also thought I was racializing the critique of Obama, even though I didn't say a word about really blackness. That wasn't my point. My point was, when you come from a certain part of the world, Africa, you develop an outlook on the world. This was Barack Obama Sr., completely different from what, let's say, one would develop by growing up, say, in Peoria or in Minnesota. And so I was saying that as someone who's myself come to America from a third world country, I can bring that anti-colonial insight and apply it to Obama, and then you can see how it illuminates Obama. It brings Obama completely to life.
Yeah.
When Obama and Michelle are sort of, jostling each other and going something like, why are we making this big deal about an American flag? Now see, Biden wouldn't say that. Jimmy Carter wouldn't say that. It takes a particular way of looking at America to see the flag itself as a symbol of oppression. Now, today, again, it's familiar. The Gaza encampments, Obama's ideology has become much more mainstream on the progressive left.
Yeah. So, and you were telling me over the weekend that when your books were coming out and you were making these pretty stunning revelations, you had friends that were saying, we need to get this to a larger audience. And this is before you became a filmmaker. But that first movie of yours, Obama's America, I think, and I watched it over the weekend again, and I think it says up front, this is based on these two books, Obama's Rage and Obama's America. Maybe you can tell our viewers, what was your thinking coming into, okay, now I want to make a film about this content?
So I have a friend, Joe Ricketts, who is the founder of Ameritrade, the big bank, and Joe's a great guy. He's a billionaire, and he really liked my book, The Roots of Obama's Rage. And he said, Dinesh, I've come up with a great idea. I'm going to buy a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal promoting your book. And I go, Joe, that'll cost you $50,000. A lot of money, even today, but at the time for sure. And I said, and I'll sell a couple of 100 books, but it's not even going to come close to 50 grand.
Right.
So it's not a wise investment. But he ignored me. He just did it. He went ahead and did it. And sure enough, I met up with him, and he's like, how are we doing? And I'm like, well, we sold a couple of 100 books, kind of like I told you. And he's like, well, it's so frustrating, Dinesh. I want to get this message not to a few thousand people or even 100,000 people, but to like 1 million people, 5 million people. How do we do that? And I go, well, you can't do that with a hardcover book. That's a limited audience. And if you sell 100,000 books in a hardcover book, you're going to be like number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. So I said, you have to make a film. And I said, I remembered myself that Michael Moore had made Fahrenheit 9/11 a few years earlier. And he goes, yeah, we should do that. So he said, why don't you go look into it? And so I talked to a couple of guys I knew who were connected with documentary films. And they did a little budget for me, and they said, basically for $2.5 million, we can make this film. So I went back to Joe, and I said, it's going to cost me $2.5 million if I do this. And so he writes a check for $100,000, and he goes, listen, find 24 other people to be your investors in this project. And so I did. It took me a little while, but I pulled it off. And that provided the equity budget to make this film. I found a film director named Jim Hainan, good guy, and Jim explained to me that a documentary film is a little different than a book. A book is a legal brief. It's an essay. And in a book, you can actually state your conclusions in advance and say, this is who I think Obama is. Let me show you in the next 10 chapters why what I'm saying is true. I'm going to look at Obama here, Obama there. And Jim said, a film doesn't work like that. A film is a journey. Mm-hmm. So a film will state a problem or a question up front. Mm-hmm. That's Act 1, framing the problem. Act 2 is the journey, in which the audience goes along with you. And in this case, I went to Hawaii, I went to Indonesia, I went to Kenya. So it's like a developing investigative quest. And at the end of Act 2, it's like, we know who Obama is. And he's actually not what we thought. It's not what people think. And so Act 2 concludes with the sort of revelation about this is the real Obama. And then Act 3 becomes, and now what? So now that we know that this is Obama, what does this mean? What do we do about it? What have we inherited here? What is our response to what we know? So that is I would call it the classic structure of a documentary film. And so I had to learn in this new format, which is a visual format. It's not about talking. You don't want to just have a bunch of people saying, oh, Obama this, Obama that. You want to move the story along, and you want to. It's almost like taking, it's like taking the audience on a tour, but this is a tour into Obama's world, and that's what we did. That's what became the film 2016, and it really struck a chord because it's, again, a film is show not tell. And so it's not like at the end of it, I'm saying this is who Obama is. You have actually gone along with me and you have seen Obama's world and you've heard people very close to him and to his dad. You've met his brother. You've seen me at the Obama homestead in Kogelo, a small village in Kenya. And so you're like, this guy knows what he's talking about, and I have heard for myself. And this whole side of Obama, I have seen nothing about in the media, not a word. So it was a completely fresh angle on Obama.
Yeah. You went to Kenya, as you say. You talked with his, I think in one case it was his younger brother who then called you later. I saw this on C-SPAN a while back, but he called you later because his son was sick in the hospital. And maybe you could just quickly tell that. Well,
this is fast forwarding now to I was president of the King's College, 2012, and my assistant comes up and says, "Oh, we have a call from George Obama," and I'm like, "George Obama from Kenya?" Now I had interviewed George Obama 2 years prior for the film, so I knew who he was, of course, but I thought it was really odd that he was calling me. And so I pick up the phone, and George is like, "Oh, Dinesh, he's like, I need help. I've got a young son who's very sick. I'm actually at the hospital right now." And George Obama is a little bit of a scam artist, so like I mentioned to you, I'm like, "George, put the nurse on the phone. Let's hear about what's really going on." But he was telling the truth, and so he said he needed $1,000, and I just sort of stepped back and thought to myself, I can help him, and I'm going to help him. But I thought, how odd. Here you have a guy who's the half-brother of the President of the United States, a guy with immense influence and access to immense resources, and yet he's calling me, not his brother. And right there, that encapsulates the utter hypocrisy of Obama. He'll go on and give speeches about we are our brother's keeper. He won't help his own brother.
Right. So your book goes, both books, a few 100,000 readers, to then, as you told me the other day, your movie is seen by 6-7 million people. How did the Obama, he's still in the presidency, I mean, this is getting close to the re-election in November of 2012, but did you get a sense of how his administration responded to the movie?
Yeah, they would routinely denounce it, and I think Obama himself, oddly enough, Obama maintained his own website, barackobama.com. You'd think when you're president that this would now become but it was Obama, because there were unsigned editorials, and so I would be attacked by name and the film clearly by Barack Obama, and I could even recognize his cadence, because Obama has a certain way of talking, and it's very unique. It's not even a normal type of presidential talk. He's always posing as an intellectual. I said because he's not a real intellectual, but he's a SWAT. He's a would-be intellectual. He'll say things like, "Well, we have to make a distinction between ISIS and ISIL." He doesn't actually know the distinction, but he makes him sound smart. So that's Obama, and so I'm like, yeah, that's Obama. I know him well enough now that I would probably recognize it even if I were to. And so I could tell that this guy was unnerved and angry, because if I had done a movie that was like a critique of Obamacare, he wouldn't care. That'd just be another critique out there. There were many others doing the same thing. But what I did was I burrowed into his soul and into his world and exposed him as a fraud, as a hypocrite, as a joke. And I think this is what he found very unnerving. And so his ultimate retaliation was to essentially unleash the Justice Department on me in a preview of subsequent politicization of the deep state, of the so-called police state. Obama, I think, got the FBI to get my bank records, because at the time a college friend of mine was running for office.
So this is still 2012 or 2013?
2012.
Okay, so right as the movie.
Right as the movie. The movie's in the theater.
Okay.
And my friend is Wendy Long, running for the Senate in New York. A very quixotic, kind of unwise project because, to run for Senate in New York, you can get the Republican nomination, but you need $25 million to run a competitive campaign and against an incumbent, no less. And so I advised her not to run. But I said, okay, well, you're my friend, so if you do run, I will help you. And so the campaign finance limit was $10,000. And so I wrote her a check for $10,000. And so I had hit the limit. But what happened is Wendy was, because her campaign was struggling, she was always asking me to do other things. Like, oh, Dinesh, we have some Indian doctors. Can you come and meet with them? Because, you're Indian, they're Indian. Maybe they'll end up contributing to my campaign. Hey, I'm doing an event in Scarsdale. Can you come and say a few words? And because I was traveling the country promoting my film, I couldn't do any of this.
Right.
So I kind of felt bad.
Right.
So I thought, well, look, maybe I can figure out a way to get her some more money. So I called two friends of mine and I said, hey, listen, do you like Wendy Long? They're like, yeah. I'm like, give her $10,000 and I'll reimburse you. Now, I should not have done this, but this is how I exceeded the campaign finance law because I ended up giving her $30,000,
right.
10 and then 10 through two of my friends. So look, this is the kind of thing that unfortunately, a lot of it happens, right? And usually when it happens, people are looking for some kind of gain.
Right.
So for example, let's say a guy is a partner in a law firm. He wants to help Obama because he wants to become, let's say, ambassador to the Bahamas.
Right.
And so he gets his other 8 law partners to all contribute to Obama, and then he funnels business their way so they make that money back, right? This happens all the time. It's never prosecuted.
Right.
Because it's considered to be, unless there is blatant quid pro quo, I'll give you $100,000 secretly and you make me a judge. That's not allowed. That's what the campaign finance law is for. But in Dinesh's case, in my case, I was giving money to a candidate who was a longtime friend. I got nothing to gain out of it. I didn't even tell Wendy Long I was doing it.
Right.
And so there was no quid pro quo. No prior involvement in anything like this. So normally it would be like, okay, we're going to give you a warning. We're going to give you a fine. We're going to give you 100 hours of community service. But because Obama was like, let's use the law to go get this guy. And let's file the case with a judge who is like in our pocket, so that this judge will then impose a very severe sentence and pretend like it's all on the up and up. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like you catch a guy for speeding, but the law is open-ended. And so what you do is instead of him getting a $200 fine, he gets 1 year in prison. Now it's like, what? Yeah, I did speed, but who gets 1 year in prison for speeding?
Right.
That's what happened to me.
So did you go into court basically and say, well, yeah, I did do this.
Yeah.
I gave $30,000 and I gave it, 20 of it through 2 friends. And
I did. And I told the judge, I go, listen, my defense is not that I didn't do it, it's selective prosecution. In other words, I am being singled out for this, even though it happens commonly, and not to mention when other people have done it, and in some cases they have been held accountable for it, their penalties are unimaginably lighter than mine.
Right.
You have a guy who gave not $20,000, but like $200,000 through a whole network of donors to the Democrats.
Right.
Indian guys, it turns out. He was a hotelier, and he got absolutely no incarceration. He just got some sort of a fine and probation, and he was off the hook.
So the penalty was you had a fine, you had 5 years probation, and then you had 8 months in sort of a halfway house.
Yeah.
What was the 8? You touched on this in your lecture the other night, but what was what did the 8 months entail?
It's 8 months in what they call a confinement center. A confinement center is a kind of a limited type of prison. It's a facility with guards. You will sleep in a dorm, typically 60 people to a room on bunk beds, 2 floors. And it's the full gamut of criminals. So some are white collar, the minority. The majority are going to be usually people who have served a fairly lengthy sentence. They're on their way back to society. Mm-hmm. And so the halfway house is exactly that. It is a transition from prison to normal life. And typically the way it works is that you are confined at night, but in the day you're allowed to get out and go work. Now you're still under conditions. You cannot drink alcohol. There are lots of things you can't do. And then you take a breathalyzer and go through a metal detector when you come back. So what I would do is I would check in typically at 7 at night. and then I would check out at about 7 in the morning.
And you said that you told Sam and I the other day that some hardened criminals that were, as you say, being phased back into society and had been in there for robbery, murder, and all these things, like describe their reaction when you told them what you were in there for.
Well, what happens is they pretty quickly, these guys, and a lot of them are pretty similar. A lot of them were, well, first of all, because it was San Diego, a lot of them were Hispanic. Quite a few of them were involved in, they were coyotes and involved in like across the border stuff, drugs. And there were a couple that were involved in like the Mexican mafia gangs, things like that. So right away they were like, well, who's this guy? Because they could tell I was, in a way, very different than they were, and mostly kept to myself. I wasn't part of the group, and now what protected me, and I knew this, and this helped me a lot, was these guys were all like 60, 90 days from getting out. So I knew they're not going to be in the mood to want to stab me or punch me, because they're going to get another 10 years if they do that.
Right.
So they don't want that. So that gives you a certain type of protection. Quite honestly, the people I was most afraid of was the U.S. government, the prison authorities. I thought if they plant drugs in my locker, I will never be able to prove it wasn't mine.
Right.
And they control my locker. They can do that easily. Yeah. So this really shows you how this was a transformative experience for me, because I recognize I actually trust the U.S. government less than I do the criminals who are with me. But they would ask me so what are you in for, and because you kind of swap. That's like your basic information. What are you in for is like question number one, even before your name.
Right.
And so I was like, it's hard for me to explain. So I would be like, well, I did a campaign finance law, violate. Oh, what's that? So I'm like, well, basically, I said I was convicted of giving away too much of my own money. And you can just imagine the impact of making a statement like that. These are people who cannot understand. To them, a crime is taking somebody else's money, not giving away your own.
Right.
And so they first of all, they thought I was kidding, that they're like, be serious and stuff like that. I'm like, no, that is what I did. And they're like, man, that is some weird ass, they could not believe it. And they kind of became, I wouldn't say fans of mine, but they came to realize that something was up here.
Yeah.
And ultimately, even the prison authorities, who were, they're just doing their job, they too started recognizing that something was up, and I think it started because I had a mandatory court hearing in New York, so I had to fly from San Diego to New York, and obviously because of that I stayed overnight. But because I stayed overnight, I went on the Megyn Kelly show that night on Fox News, and this was part of my way of using the media to push back. But it made me an instant celebrity, because when I came back to the confinement center, one of the guards was like, wait, did I see you last night on Megyn Kelly? And so he told everybody else. And then pretty soon all these guards and stuff were like, I wouldn't say there's no such thing as special treatment, because I was getting the same treatment as everybody else. But on the other hand, they were friendly to me, and they would accommodate my requests within reason.
So after the 8 months you served your time, did the Obama DOJ continue to harass you in any way?
They really couldn't, but because I had completed my sentence. But I did have a probation officer, and what that means is that the probation officer controls your travel. Mm-hmm. And can come and show up at your house at any time and search.
Yeah.
So it was kind of awkward. I mean, I was, Debbie, my wife, was like, "This is really strange" and stuff like that, and also Debbie was a CHL, a concealed. She had a license to have a concealed gun, and she had done gun training and things like that. But on the other hand, the simple truth of it is, when you have a felony conviction, you cannot have a gun in the house. You can't. It's absolutely prohibited. And so we were, living under those conditions. If I traveled particularly abroad and I took my passport and put it in the scanner, it would exit out.
Yeah.
And I'd have to go into a special room and typically show that I had permission to travel. In one or two cases, they would call my probation officer. You're living under scrutiny. I didn't have like an ankle bracelet or anything, but I was free, but I was definitely and I couldn't vote. I couldn't certainly own a firearm. So it wasn't until I got a presidential pardon in 2018. So this is a few years later.
Right.
My case had concluded in 14. My sentence finished in 15. It was in May of 2018 that I got an official pardon from Trump, and it completely cleared my record.
So Trump comes in January of 2017.
Right.
And then, I mean, you don't have to reveal all of the inner workings and the names, but maybe you could just describe what led up to you getting the phone call from Donald Trump.
Well, fortunately, my wife is really good friends with Ted Cruz, and he agreed to ask Trump if he would pardon me. And that's kind of all it took. Trump apparently had been familiar with my case, not the details, but he'd heard about it. And I think his instinct was that they're going after Dinesh because of who he is, not because of what he did. This is a political witch hunt. And of course, I think Trump had no inkling that it would be happening to him 10 times over.
Well, and that's the point you made at your lecture the other night, is that really your case was the first one. I mean, now you see all these January 6th protesters are being persecuted. Obviously, Donald Trump's being persecuted with these indictments. But this really was like a forerunner to everything that we're seeing now.
In retrospect, yes. I mean, at the time, I didn't look at it that way. I wasn't like, here's my case and it's a forerunner of the police state. No, I looked at it like, here's my case, and it's the case where the empire strikes back. I had a big, sign on my back. I should have known that if I go after Obama, he's going to go after me. He's a vindictive narcissist. So I saw it as a one-off. And little did I know that Obama was inaugurating something that would escalate under Biden, a complete systematic repression of the opposition, repression of speech, that's the censorship industry, and then also political targeting.
Okay, so we've got 6-7 minutes left. Now that, I mean, this book, 2010, that's 14 years ago. Your movie was 12 years ago. We're in 2024. It's another election year. How has your views like changed or even been more enhanced on that message that you were coming out with 10, 12 years ago?
Well, it's not so much that I have changed. It's really, I think, more that there is now that we have a much better view of Obama. I think the mask has come off, and it took a while for that to happen. But I think people who today go back and look at the film or read the book would completely recognize Obama. I think that the interesting question for me today is whether we are living through Obama's third term and potentially headed to Obama's fourth term, which would give him an FDR-style control over the country. And you can't fundamentally remake a country in one term. I don't even think you can remake it in 2 terms.
Right.
But you can remake it in 4 terms.
Yeah.
As FDR did. America at the end of FDR was very different than it was before. Not for the better, for the most part. And with Obama the same. So I see the fingerprints of Obama continuing with Biden's policies. We know for sure that Biden is surrounded by Obamaites, Obama acolytes, and Obama staff from the Obama years. We also know that Biden is not directly the one that is steering the canoe. He's in the canoe, and he's a collaborator. He's a willing. He's willing to let himself be puppeteered by others. But who are those others? We don't know for sure, but the heavy betting is that this is essentially an Obama claque, an Obama gang, possibly led by Obama himself.
Yeah, and you told me the other night you feel like that they want to hang on to Biden as the puppet because they can control him totally, whereas if it was some other, up-and-coming Democrat that they replaced Biden with, he'd come in there and probably want to do, some of his own ideas and policies, whereas in this case, the puppet master is getting to do pretty much what he wants.
Yeah, and the ventriloquist likes the puppet because the ventriloquist controls himself and the puppet. So the whole routine depends on the ventriloquist being both people. Right? Now, if you had, instead of a puppet, you had, let's just say, a 10-year-old or 12-year-old. That guy would say whatever he wants. The show would be ruined. It wouldn't work. So I think that the puppeteer is like having a puppet. They are essentially a junta running the country. We don't even know who they are. So in a sense, it's very alarming. We're in a perilous stage because we're a democracy on the surface, on the facade, but we don't even know. I mean, even authoritarian societies abroad, we know who's running them. We know Xi is running China. We know Putin's running Russia. We don't even know who's running our own country.
Do you think that, I mean, going back to Obama's influence, you said earlier about his first and second term that, what he said didn't square with what he was actually doing. Do you feel like now he's just, because he's hiding a bit behind the puppet, that he's just taken the mask off? I mean, you see the wide open invasion at the border and just all of these policies that got their start under Obama when he was in the Oval Office.
Yeah, in a way, Obama doesn't have to manage his own reputation anymore because he's operating indirectly. Any backlash that came to, let's say, an open border policy would hit Biden, not Obama. So Obama is able to try things. It's kind of like it's like if I go out on the field, I might get hurt. But if I have some surrogates, I can say, all right, well, go, or you're a general, you're not rushing the hill. You tell these, so run up the hill, see what happens, machine gun fire, the guy gets killed. Oh, okay, well, it wasn't me. You wouldn't run up the hill because then you'd be weighing it more carefully. So what I'm getting at with Obama was, I think in his own administration, he was, because he is a narcissist, he was very much the supervisor of his own image. He's like, I don't want to go too far over here. And but I think when he is the puppeteer, he's perfectly willing to let the puppet take the risk.
Maybe your next book should be the fruits of Obama's fourth term. Let's hope it doesn't happen.
Well, at the end of these two books, people will be like, Dinesh, why are you so obsessed with Obama? And I'm like, I'm not obsessed with Obama. I made a film called Hillary's America. I've written about a lot of presidents. I wrote a book on Reagan. So in other words, I laid out a thesis about Obama. Had it been, fundamentally mistaken, I might have had to do a clarification or do something subsequently. But I think that the two books, I'm proud of them because I think, first of all, I think it's been, that was a pivotal moment in 21st century history. I think historians will look back on it. So the book is not like one of those books that just becomes so dated that why would anybody even open it a decade later? No, it's actually very interesting to open it now. It pertains to things going on now. So I'm happy with that work. I wouldn't redo it now, but it seems to me it's just part of the corpus of my work, and it represented a turning point, partly because it opened the door to the films. I've now done 7, working on number 8. So it created a new chapter in my career.
Dinesh D'Souza, thanks for joining us on the Trumpet Daily.
A pleasure.